Story 1. When I was a child, my parents left for work early, so I stayed at my grandmother's until school. After she passed away in my junior year, I went straight home instead. My mom started noticing the phone in her room was left off the hook daily, though I hadn't touched it. One day, I came home early and heard footsteps in her bedroom. When I checked, the phone was off the hook, stretched as if someone had held it there. I replicated the placement multiple times, but it only fell to that exact spot if carefully placed. Later, the phone rang. It was my dad saying he had called earlier, but no one had spoken. After that, the phone stayed on the hook. Story 2. Around 1998, my family moved into an old house with large windows facing the backyard. One night, my brother whispered for me to stay still. When I turned, I saw a massive dog's head outside, nearly nose to glass with me. It quickly disappeared, leaping over the 4.5-foot fence with ease. Later, we saw it again, circling the yard, watching us through the window. My dad even fired at it with his shotgun, but it ran off. We moved out 6 months later. It haunted us for a long time. Story 3. I woke up to my bedroom door creaking open, with the outline of a person standing there. But when I turned on the light, no one was there, though the door was still closing as if someone had just left. My fire alarm in the hallway lit up, sensing movement. Yet no one was there. To this day, I still get chills remembering that night. Story 4. My friend and I often discussed dreams, and he once described a vivid one where he was hit by a car while skateboarding in black clothes. He could even see his own funeral. A few years later, the dream happened exactly as he described, down to the black clothes and skateboard. To this day, I wonder how he could have seen his own death like that. Story 5. My grandfather dreamt about a plane crashing near Midway Airport in Chicago. In the dream, he was one of the first responders and found the pilot decapitated. Weeks later, a plane crash happened precisely as he dreamt it, down to the pilot's condition. He'd told the family about the dream beforehand, making it even eerier. Story 6. One day, while pushing my elderly grandmother in her wheelchair, she casually told us a strange story about my mom's sister's friend who had been found dead at the bottom of a staircase in Spain. She even mentioned that her daughter was suspected of the crime. A couple of years later, my aunt called with news that matched every detail my grandmother had mentioned. The only eerie part? My grandmother had been dead for 18 months by then. Story 7. My uncle, an artist, used to draw comic book-style pictures of himself. He was tragically killed in a hit-and-run accident, and one arm was nearly severed. After his passing, we found a self-portrait where he'd drawn himself with a shoe flying off in the background and a line on his arm labeled "Cut Here." We still wonder if he had somehow foreseen the accident. Story 8. I once found a garbage bag filled with what looked like red sludge and white sticks while biking as a child. Though I thought it was blood and bones, I convinced myself it wasn't. A couple of days later, when I returned, the bag was gone. Now, as an adult, I realized what I saw was likely exactly what I feared. Story 9. While running on a quiet gravel trail, I encountered an older man in all gray, including gray skin and gray eyes, carrying a black plastic bag. As I passed him, he didn't acknowledge me and just kept smiling. A wave of nausea hit me as I ran by, and when I looked back, he had vanished completely. The trail was open and flat, so I should have been able to see him, but he was gone without a trace. Story 10. Once, while jogging at night near Detroit, I noticed a man sprinting towards me with a steel object in his hand. He had a wild grin and appeared out of nowhere. As he neared, he abruptly turned down an alley I hadn't seen. Days later, I saw a news report on a man wanted for murder who matched his description. I haven't jogged in the city since. Story 11. My friend Ava and I were 10 years old when we noticed a white van following us while we were walking her dog. Terrified, we approached a woman with 2 dogs and pretended to know her. She took us seriously and stayed with us until the van drove away. Later, we learned the men in the van were convicted pedophiles and were arrested. Looking back, it's chilling to think about what might have happened if we hadn't approached that woman. Story 12. My dad's house had a creepy basement with a dark storage room visible from the elliptical machine. While working out one day, I felt someone behind me and turned to see a dark figure with light gray eyes staring at me from the storage room. I was alone, so I hid in the bathroom until I got the courage to sprint upstairs. Strangely, it wasn't the first time I'd seen that gray-eyed figure. Story 13. At 9 years old, I was biking home on a road with only a few streetlights. While waiting at the edge of the lights, I saw a figure walking down the hill toward me. It passed through a tree shadow and disappeared without a trace. Later, I learned my father had seen the same figure while walking home years before. Locals say she's a ghost, often seen on that hill, vanishing halfway down. Story 14. My ex-wife and I were caretaking a house with an unsettling basement. Every time we turned off the light, we felt something was about to grab us. One night, our wind-up alarm clock went off at 2 a.m., even though we'd set it for 6 a.m. As I woke up, I saw a small, gremlin-like figure run out of the room. My ex saw it too, and to this day, I can't explain what we saw. Story 15. My parents' bedroom faced ours, and one night, my dad saw a dark, grotesque face peeking upside down from the doorframe of my room. Thinking he was seeing things, he stayed quiet until my mom asked if he'd seen the thing in the kids' room too. He rushed to check, but there was nothing there. It only happened once, but it left us all terrified. Story 16. My brother and I once heard my daughter's voice respond, "Okay, coming!" after I called her to join us for dinner. 10 minutes later, she still hadn't shown up, so I checked her room. No one was there. I called her cell, and she was still at her grandmother's house. My brother and I both heard her voice. To this day, I have no explanation for it. Story 17. Alone at home with my Great Dane, I heard him growling at the basement. I stood by him and shouted, "Whatever you are, you don't pay enough bills here to be freaking us out." Suddenly, a voice from behind me, where there was a wall, said, "Okay, fine, I'll go." My dog yelped and turned around. That night, every light in the house stayed on, and I slept with a baseball bat by my side. Story 18. While studying abroad in the UK, I lived in a house rumored to be haunted by a young girl's spirit. One night, at around 2 a.m., I woke up to my door rattling and a faint voice saying, "Hello?" I brushed it off as a dream. The next morning, my housemate told me she'd heard footsteps from the cellar around the same time, followed by the sound of the door rattling. We were both shaken by the shared experience. Story 19. Some friends and I used to visit an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. One night as we arrived, a light turned on inside. There was no power and no cars were around. We never went back. Years later, we wondered if it might have been a hunting cabin or a place for something sketchier, but at the time, it scared us enough to stay away. Story 20. In college, my boyfriend once saw a shadow behind me that looked like him as I bent over to pick something up. Weeks later, my roommate packed her things in the middle of the night saying she'd seen my boyfriend sitting at my desk, only to look over and realize he was asleep next to me. We hadn't told her about the shadow. After that, I was certain we had some kind of ghostly visitor. Story 21. My first job was as a radio DJ in a remote station. Shadows would dart around and lights flickered on and off. One night, I saw the shadow of a man near the door, but no one was there. My boss nonchalantly said, "Oh, you've seen Jimmy," the original station owner. Jimmy seemed harmless, but another presence, a shin-high shadow, always made me uneasy. One night, the front door, which was locked, swung open on its own. I ran to my car, but before leaving, I looked back to see a figure silhouetted against the transmitter light. It still haunts me to this day. Story 22. A woman stopped me from crossing the street by putting her arm in front of me. Seconds later, a car crash occurred right where I would have been. When I turned to thank her, she was gone, with no place she could have disappeared to so quickly. I can't explain it, but I owe my life to that mysterious stranger. Story 23. After a double mastectomy during COVID, I couldn't have visitors overnight in the hospital. One night, an elderly woman appeared, held my hand, and comforted me. When the nurse came in at 4 a.m., the woman vanished. Yet, when I looked down, my hand was still in a clasped position, as if someone had just let go. I don't know who she was, but I felt comforted. Story 24. My friends and I would explore an abandoned house miles away from anywhere. One night, a light turned on in the house as we pulled up, even though it had no power. There were no cars, and the remote location made it unlikely anyone else was there. Spooked, we drove off and never went back, wondering if we had encountered something unexplainable. Story 25. In my dorm room, my boyfriend once saw a shadow figure behind me that looked like him. A few weeks later, my roommate woke up in the middle of the night to find what she thought was my boyfriend sitting at the desk, only to see him asleep next to me. We never told her about the shadow sighting. Living there, I always felt like someone else was around. Story 26. My mom has a story of her dad vividly dreaming about a plane crashing near their house, where he became one of the first responders. A few weeks later, a plane crash happened, and he was indeed one of the first on the scene. The details matched his dream almost exactly, down to the captain's injuries. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow foreseen it. Story 27. Once, while biking in the countryside as a child, I stopped to catch my breath when I saw a person walking down a hill toward me. As they passed through a shadow, they disappeared completely. I thought my mind was playing tricks, but years later, I found out others had seen the same figure vanish at that spot, including my father. Local legends say it's the ghost of a woman who appears at twilight. Story 28. My grandfather was an artist and drew many portraits of himself in a comic book style. He was killed in a hit-and-run accident where his shoe flew off, and his arm was nearly severed. After his death, we found a self-portrait he'd done, with his shoe flying off and his arm marked with a "cut here" line. It left us wondering if he had somehow predicted his own death. Story 29. A friend once told me about a dream where he got hit by a car while skateboarding and could see his own funeral. Years later, he died in a nearly identical accident, down to the details of what he was wearing and who attended his funeral. The eerie part is that he had described everything to me years before, and it all came true. Story 30. My father once saw an unsettling figure with dark, piercing eyes peeking into our home. It disappeared before he could reach it, but he was convinced it wasn't human. He's not one to believe in paranormal things, but he insists that what he saw that night was beyond explanation. It left him uneasy for weeks. Story 31. My dad's basement had a creepy storage room you could see from the elliptical machine. One day, while exercising, I looked over my shoulder and saw a dark figure with gray eyes standing in the doorway, staring right at me. I was alone and terrified. After that, I avoided using the elliptical, convinced I'd seen something unexplainable. Story 32. As a teenager, I was biking home one evening. I stopped at the edge of the streetlight's glow, and up ahead, I saw a person walking down the hill. They passed into a thin shadow cast by a tree, and then they were gone. Years later, I learned that my father had seen the same figure vanish in the same place, and the locals claimed it was a ghost that had been spotted for decades. Story 33. My uncle used to draw comic-style sketches of himself, always with a certain flair. After he was tragically killed in an accident, we found a drawing of him with one shoe flying in the background and a mark on his arm labeled "Cut Here." That drawing was hauntingly similar to the way he died. It's something that's haunted our family ever since. Story 34. My dad often looked into our bedroom from across the hall, and one night he saw a grotesque face peeking into our room from the top of the door frame. He dismissed it until my mom, without prompting, asked him if he'd seen something in the kids' room. He sprinted over, but of course, there was nothing there. It happened only once, but we never forgot it. Story 35. My brother and I heard my daughter answer when I called her to join us for dinner. When she didn't come, I checked her room, only to find she was still at her grandmother's house. My brother and I both heard her voice, though she was miles away. Neither of us has any explanation for it, and it still unnerves us to this day. Story 36. While my fiancé was away, I was alone at home with our dog. One night, he growled at the basement, his hackles raised. Trying to calm myself, I yelled, "You don't pay enough bills here to scare us!" Suddenly, a voice from behind me, where there was a wall, said, "Okay, fine, I'll go." My dog yelped, and I spent the rest of the night with every light on and a bat by my side. Story 37. My college dorm in the UK was rumored to be haunted by a girl who had passed away there. One night I heard the door rattle and a faint female voice calling, "Hello?" I dismissed it as a dream, but the next morning my friend told me she'd heard footsteps coming up from the cellar at the same time. We both felt we had a visitor that night. Story 38. My friends and I explored an old house in the woods several times. One night, as we approached, a light flicked on inside, even though the house had no power. We quickly drove away and never returned. Looking back, we realize it could have been anything, but at the time, it felt otherworldly. Story 39. One night, my boyfriend saw a shadowy figure standing behind me that looked like him, down to his afro hairstyle. Weeks later, my roommate left the dorm room in the middle of the night, saying she'd seen my boyfriend sitting at my desk, only to realize he was asleep next to me. We never told her about the previous sighting, but her reaction confirmed we weren't alone. Story 40. My grandfather vividly dreamed about a plane crash near Midway Airport in Chicago and woke up unsettled. Weeks later, he was one of the first responders at a real crash in that area, finding the exact same scene he'd described. The family remembered his dream, and the experience haunted him for the rest of his life. Story 41. A friend and I often discuss dreams, and he once shared a vivid one where he saw himself getting hit by a car while skateboarding in black clothes. He described his own funeral with his crush in attendance. Years later, he died in a similar accident, and every detail he had described came true. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that he somehow foresaw his own death. Story 42. I used to live close to Detroit, and one night while jogging, I saw a man sprinting toward me with a grin on his face and something metallic in his hand. Just before he reached me, he turned down an alley and disappeared. Days later, I saw his face on the news. A man wanted for murder. I haven't jogged in the city since. Story 43. My dad's basement had a creepy storage room that was always visible from the elliptical. While exercising one day, I felt a presence and turned to see a dark figure with gray eyes staring at me from the doorway. I was alone and terrified. It was one of the most unsettling moments of my life, and I never used that machine again. Story 44. When I was 10, my friend Ava and I noticed a white van slowly following us as we walked her dog. Panicked, we pretended to know a nearby woman, explaining our fears to her. The van eventually drove off, but later we learned the men inside were convicted pedophiles. It's terrifying to think what might have happened if we hadn't acted quickly. Story 45. One night, I was home alone with my Great Dane, who refused to go into the basement. I heard him growling at the top of the stairs, his hair standing up. Trying to be brave, I shouted, "You don't pay bills here, so leave!" From directly behind me, I heard a voice say, "Okay, fine, I'll go." My dog and I were frozen with fear, and I spent the night with every light on. Story 46. In college, my roommate and I shared a dorm rumored to be haunted. One night around 2 a.m., I woke up to my door rattling and a faint voice saying, "Hello?" The next morning, my roommate mentioned hearing footsteps and the door rattling. Neither of us knew what happened, but we both felt we weren't alone that night. Story 47. My friends and I would occasionally explore a spooky, abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. One night, we pulled up, and a light turned on inside. The house had no power, and there were no cars or people around. We sped off, and none of us ever went back. We still talk about what could have turned that light on. Story 48. My boyfriend and I once saw a shadow figure that looked exactly like him standing behind me. Weeks later, my roommate left our dorm in the middle of the night, claiming she'd seen my boyfriend sitting at the desk, only to realize he was asleep next to me. We never told her about the previous sighting, but it left us all convinced there was a ghost. Story 49. While caring for a house, my wife and I felt something eerie in the basement, as if something was watching us. One night, our wind-up alarm clock, which was set for 6 a.m., went off at 2 a.m., waking us up in a panic. I saw a small, goblin-like figure scurry out of the room. My wife saw it too. We both felt shaken for days and could never explain it. Story 50. Once, a stranger stopped me from crossing the street by holding her arm in front of me. A split second later, a car accident occurred right where I would have been standing. When I turned to thank her, she was gone, with nowhere to disappear to so quickly. I still don't know how to explain it, but I'm grateful she appeared that day. Story 51. I once saw a man on a rural trail who seemed strange. He was entirely gray skin, gray clothes, gray eyes, and had a plastic bag slung over his shoulder. As I passed him, he didn't acknowledge me, just kept a wide grin on his face. The smell of decay was overwhelming. I ran forward and looked back, but he had vanished, though the trail was flat and open for miles. Story 52. My dad often stayed in the hospital during my mother's treatment, and one night he woke up to see a gray figure standing at the foot of her bed. He thought it was a nurse, but the figure vanished as soon as he blinked. Later, he learned that other patients had reported seeing similar figures near beds just before someone passed away. Story 53. While working a job that required long hours alone, I noticed shadows darting around at the edge of my vision. One night, a locked door opened on its own, and the figure of a man stood in the doorway. I rushed out, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. I never felt comfortable working alone there after that. Story 54. My mom's fire alarm once went off for no reason in the middle of the night, sensing cigarette smoke. No one in our house smokes, but it happened on my grandfather's birthday. He was a heavy smoker until he died of cancer. We took it as a sign he was visiting, though it was unsettling. Story 55. One day, my grandmother mentioned an old friend's death in Spain, saying the friend's daughter was suspected. 2 years later, my aunt called to tell my mom the exact story. When my mom mentioned she'd already heard it from my grandmother, my aunt went silent. The friend had died the previous night, 18 months after my grandmother had passed. Story 56. My uncle was killed in a hit-and-run accident, his shoe knocked off in the collision. We later found a self-portrait he'd drawn with a shoe flying off in the background and a line on his arm labeled, "Cut Here." It felt like he had somehow seen his own fate, and it has haunted my family ever since. Story 57. I was biking down a rural road and found a garbage bag filled with what looked like blood and bones. Too terrified to look closer, I biked away. When I returned later, the bag was gone. Years later, I realized what I'd seen was likely exactly what I feared. The memory still haunts me. Story 58. My dad once saw a dark figure with glowing eyes outside our window, crouched but standing on its hind legs. It looked like a massive dog but moved unnaturally, almost like a human. When he fired a shotgun at it, the creature ran off, jumping over our fence. We moved away not long after, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Story 59. A strange woman once stopped me on the street and put her arm in front of me, saying, "Wait." Seconds later, a car crash happened in front of me. When I turned to thank her, she was gone, with no place nearby where she could have disappeared. To this day, I don't know if she was real or some kind of guardian angel. Story 60. My roommate and I shared a haunted dorm room. One night, around 2 a.m., I heard the door rattling and a faint female voice saying, "Hello." My roommate heard footsteps coming from the cellar at the same time. We both felt there was something, or someone, unseen with us that night. Story 61. My father worked the night shift as a security guard in an old building rumored to be haunted. He would often hear footsteps echoing in empty hallways and doors creaking open on their own. One night, he saw a shadowy figure standing at the end of a hallway. He called out, but it vanished instantly. He never forgot that night and eventually quit due to the eerie experiences. Story 62. My first job was in a small-town radio station where strange things often happened. One night, while I was alone, the locked front door suddenly opened by itself. Moments later, I saw a shadowy figure near the transmitter room. The next day, my boss casually told me that Jimmy, the original owner, liked to check in from time to time. It was unsettling, but I tried to make peace with Jimmy's visits. Story 63. My grandmother had a very vivid dream about an old friend who passed away, seeing her in a peaceful meadow. The next morning, she received a call informing her of the friend's death the previous night. She never believed in paranormal experiences, but this one shook her. Story 64. My friends and I would often explore an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. One night, as we approached, we saw a light turn on inside. None of us dared to go in, and we quickly drove away. Later, we learned that the house had been empty for years and had no power connected to it. Story 65. One night, I was jolted awake by a sound coming from my baby monitor. A voice saying, "Don't be afraid." I checked on my baby, but the room was empty. The monitor only ever picked up sounds from inside the house, and I had no idea who or what could have made that voice. To this day, I still don't have an explanation. Story 66. My mother once shared a story of a woman appearing in her bedroom late at night dressed in old-fashioned clothing. The woman sat on the edge of her bed, watching her until she vanished. My mom is not easily frightened, but she admits that the woman's visit left her feeling uneasy for weeks. Story 67. My grandfather swore he saw a man standing outside his window one night dressed in military attire from decades past. He blinked, and the man was gone. My grandfather, a veteran himself, later learned that a soldier had lived in the house many years ago. He always felt a connection to that figure, as if they shared a mutual understanding. Story 68. While studying late one night, I saw a shadowy figure move past my bedroom door. Thinking it was my brother, I called out, but there was no response. I checked his room, and he was sound asleep. I felt a chill, and even now I wonder if someone else had been there that night. Story 69. My cousin told me a story about her childhood home. One night, she saw a shadow figure standing at the foot of her bed. It didn't move, just stared. She shut her eyes in fear, and when she opened them, it was gone. Years later, she learned that previous residents had reported seeing the same figure. It left her wondering who or what had been visiting her. Story 70. My aunt once rented an old farmhouse that had an eerie, unsettling vibe. Doors would open and close by themselves, and she often heard footsteps on the stairs when she was alone. One night, she woke up to see a figure standing in the doorway. She blinked, and it was gone. She moved out not long after, convinced the house was haunted.